So the title nods to a couple of existing travelogues. So I guess first it alludes to Patrick Leigh Fermor's Between the Woods and the Water, which was his journey to Constantinople in the 30s, I think. And then much more recently, Gail Simmons wrote a book about walking a pilgrimage along the South Downs Way, called Between the Chalk and the Sea. So there was a sort of historical precedent and a kind of more modern one. Um, the title originally wasn't my devising, and that's probably a surprise to some people, but not a surprise to others. So during the early sort of editorial kind of acquisition meetings, whilst the book was kind of being brought on to MUP's list, the commissioning editor and I kind of like spitballed a few ideas, and we sort of went through a series and kind of thought about, particularly about Gail's book, but also the Patrick Leigh Fermor one, and thought about the sort of symbolism, the motifs that are in the book, and Between the Salt and the Ash came to sort of encapsulate a lot of the themes. It was quite pithy, but also quite metaphorical, quite poetic. So we kind of eventually like tag teamed it into being, I guess. I think like voice is the key word there. So I became aware probably as an undergraduate. So I'd left the Northeast and went to the Northwest, studied in Chester, and like not a huge journey, about 180 miles, but enough of a kind of cross Pennine journey to realise that having a Northeast accent was different to having a Northwest one. And sort of began a series of poetic kind of journeys into like thinking about voice and dialect and accent, which really got going like a couple of years ago. I say a couple, it's probably like 5 or 6 years ago now. My sense of time is completely shot. Where I was really getting into reading like dialect fiction, dialect poetry, kind of stuff that really had a strong sense of vernacular, and started experimenting with that as a sort of way of I guess kind of challenging what an RP English voiced poem or novel or non-fiction work might look like. So there's that actual kind of like the orality of it, but then there's also this sense, I think, that figuratively speaking, like the Northeast or any kind of region or nation even, um, some nations and regions have a bigger voice, say on a kind of national or global stage. We're all very aware of how dominant the Southeastern voice is, be that in politics, culture, economically, however else. Sort of realizing that the Northeast voice had historically kind of been diminished, or it had been overlooked or marginalized. So there's the kind of like the actual accent and voice, and then there's that idea of wanting to kind of give voice to a place and a community. There's a series of answers really. There's a sort of an answer rooted in me being a poet and writing poems. So there was a particular poem that I wrote about 6 or 7 years ago called Davy, and that was all about the mining safety lamp, which forms the kind of core symbolic image of the cover and is the kind of narrative touchstone throughout Between the Salt and the Ash. So I sort of imagined my great grandfather, his life, his work. I sort of imagined relighting this item, and it's a fiction, really, right? Because like I didn't actually do that, but that, of course, is the great beauty of poetry and of creative nonfiction. It doesn't actually have to have happened, but the poem or the piece of literature that comes out of it can kind of bear witness to that truth in a different way. So there was that as a kind of like a motif that I was interested in doing more with. I'd sort of acquired this item. It was a family heirloom, and I'd been given it by my nana, and it was something that I wanted to, I guess, kind of explore its history, its sort of symbolism. Um, Around that sort of time, I had been doing a number of pilgrimages and arts projects, which involved walking. So one out on the Sefton coast on Merseyside, walking with artists up to Southport, and that kind of project that established really this interest in I guess kind of like what it means to walk with other people, whether they're like photographers, visual artists, or just the general public, people who are interested in their kind of their patch. So I sort of had the methodological like basis for it already established, and I knew quite early on that I would try to meet up with like-minded people, or with people who could tell me a little bit more about a particular locale, who might offer sort of an insight that I otherwise just wouldn't have. So there was there was the kind of symbolism and the metaphor kind of meeting the method and the more kind of workaday sort of angle to it. And I'd been doing every summer solstice and continue to walk a pilgrimage in memory of the poet Bill Martin. And I first did this, now let me get this right, I think 2016. So I was asked to carry his ashes to the cathedral by his son, and so we set about kind of spreading the ashes at key points along the route, and then the end of the walk, the remains of the ashes went into the River Wear. So I think in some ways that was the kind of end of the book mapped out from probably like 2016. I knew that there was a book that would end at Durham Cathedral. It then became about like, where did it start? And as you get into kind of the narrative nonfiction world and plotting out a book length kind of creative nonfiction thing, you can cross-refer to those people like Gail Simmons or Patrick Leigh Fermor and go, that's the A point. And it very quickly became apparent that it had to be Lindisfarne. And there was the A, and there was the B, and there was everything else in the middle that I could then explore on foot in this book. Yeah. A big one that I wasn't expecting was the kind of like the religious dimension to the pilgrimage. In many ways, like, is super obvious, right? And it's like, it should be completely obvious that there's huge religious overtones in any kind of journey to a cathedral. But in my kind of weird way of doing things, like, that just never was at the forefront of my consciousness until I actually got to about halfway through the route. So part one of the book kind of closes as I cross the River Tyne, and part two opens on the south side of the river at Jarrow, and that is a historically important site, kind of going right back to the 8th century and to kind of people like Bede and the kind of who sort of deemed the father of English history, and the monastery there, which is kind of as I say, been there for hundreds of years. And I met with the priest there, Reverend Leslie Jones, just kind of emailed her a week or two before to say, hey, I'm passing through, like, just to let you know, kind of thing. And she was lovely. And it was kind of quite weird, really, because there was this moment where towards the end she said, like, can I pray for you? Can I pray for you to send you on your journey? And I was quite like bizarrely taken aback by this, and sort of had this moment of like, well, of course, she's a priest, I'm in a church, of course she's gonna offer that. And I was kind of like awkwardly like I guess like, okay, and sort of didn't really know what to do, because I'm not a religious person. I'm kind of somebody who's kind of interested in faith and spirituality and belonging, but I'm not sort of like belonging to a church or anything. So that felt like a really transformative moment, to think that that the journey had actually been blessed, and that I was actually kind of being sent with kind of goodwill. There was a few other points, like I talk about this quite a lot in the chapter. I absolutely fell in love with Amble, town sort of midway down the Northumberland coast, just such a sort of beautiful place now, a place that perhaps 20 years ago was still quite run down, and it still has pockets of deprivation and stuff, but it's kind of this beautiful spot with these kind of Scandi like flats on the river, and it's like a lovely place. And I was escorted there by the artist Catherine Renton, and Catherine's work just really kind of brought that to life, and I thought that was just an amazing place. I could have just spent the rest of the trip in Amble, frankly. And I'm going to bring it back to Durham as well. Like, I think reading at the cathedral service for the Miners' Gala, I was asked to do that kind of coincidentally, really. Like, I hadn't planned it that it would happen whilst I was writing Between the Salt and the Ash, but that's that kind of perfect moment of serendipity where I was sort of maybe 2/3 of the way through the manuscript, and then I got asked to read a poem, which was the Davy poem that I talked about previously. So kind of invited up to the lectern in Durham Cathedral, and was incredibly nervous, to put it mildly, but it was one of those truly kind of like life-affirming moments. And yeah, I think it probably transformed how I see my relationship to that space, and to the others really. Like, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Christianity and coal, I guess, were the pillars. The kind of like the bedrock, literally, kind of geologically, with the coal and the kind of capitalism driven by the extraction of coal, which the northeast and Britain more generally is kind of famed for, really. But we now understand, I guess, as kind of having produced some of the problems we're seeing in the world, right? So climate change, there's kind of no getting away from the fact that that as an industry polluted the environment and kind of wasn't good. So we shouldn't lament, I don't think, that kind of that passing. However, I think that the northeast and other regions are still sort of in the process of mourning the communities and the coal working families who kind of were so tight knit, and I think we're still trying to process that grief and that kind of intergenerational trauma. And it's only kind of 30 years ish since the last colliery in the region shut, and so there's plenty of men and women who have living memories of that industry. And I find it interesting that in the region now we're seeing painters and photographers who are kind of broadly like my sort of age, people like myself, poets and writers, who are engaging with this material. I think that tells us something quite interesting about why this stuff is still important, and why it sort of still has resonance, I guess. For anybody who's been to the Durham Miners Gala in recent years, it's phenomenally well attended. Like, you go there now, and there are hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets of Durham, which, let's face it, isn't massive. So it's like this massive spectacle seeing all these people, and it tells me that that spirit of kind of comradeship is still something that people are kind of hungering for, I guess. So even though the mines have gone and they're closed, and arguably we're probably better off for that kind of environmentally, people are, I think, seeking to find kind of ways of understanding their life and to give it meaning. And the Christianity thing, I mean, I'm probably not qualified enough to talk about this, but I think probably it's part of this wider trend of people wanting to understand the history they've come from. And my sense is that people in the northeast are still really, kind of keen to understand. It is that I would want to kind of try and quash some of those cliches and out of date images, which sadly I think do persist. Um, I think I would start by saying that this is a very pioneering region. It's kind of a land of firsts. First lighthouse to be lit by electricity. Um, First kind of history of the English people to go back to Bede. And that isn't just stuff that's been pioneered in the past, right? So if you look to the arts sector in the region, just to give two quick examples, I think that on the River Wear in Sunderland, former shipyard, kind of capital, like centre for building ships in the 20th century. The Crownwork studios are now being developed at a site in Pallion. So once we built ships, now we're going to make TV shows and films, which I think is really interesting and kind of speaks to the confidence in a city like Sunderland. And then in my area, in publishing and in writing and literature, New Writing North are soon to open the Centre for Writing in Newcastle at Bolbeck Hall, which I think is just a phenomenal kind of vote of confidence, again, in the Northeast, and in the ability for writers to be championed and supported, and for us to tell new stories about the region. So I think we're pioneering on that level. I think we are passionate. So there's a chapter in the book where I talk about there was this marketing campaign kind of early 2000s, and you used to see it all the time at like Newcastle Airport or at the train station, which was passionate people, passionate places. And initially I was like, oh, it's a bit kind of corny, isn't it? But actually, like, the more I thought about it, like, it was really bang on, because generally, not everybody is passionate. Like, there's some people who are perhaps passionate in different ways. They don't have to kind of vocalize it. But generally speaking, you do find quite outspoken and kind of emotionally invested and passionate people in the region. And I think that we are passionate, and I think that that kind of pride, which can also have a dark underbelly, pride can kind of manifest in kind of jingoistic and kind of closed-minded ways, but it generally, in my view, kind of comes out in pride in place, pride in kind of comradeship and family, and kind of sense of like the topography, the hills of say the Cheviots down the kind of beautiful coastline that we have, the rivers, Hadrian's Wall, all that sort of stuff. And as I've said, kind of like that cultural kind of stuff that's come out of all of that landscape and which is now being celebrated. So I think it's an exciting moment for the region actually, and I kind of would like people to think about that as like this is not the end of the story, and the Northeast is maybe about to embark on a new chapter. Okay, so I am not on commission when I say this, but I am definitely going to send everybody up to Amble. I think Amble is a wonderful seaside town that is kind of the gateway, I guess, to like Northumberland. So if you're wanting to explore all of the wonderful sites like Holy Island and Bamborough and Cragside and all the places that I would also send you to, I would stay in Amble because it's kind of like really handy. It's got everything that you need and kind of want. It's got some cool new like places to eat and places to drink. It's just a wonderful little kind of gem of a coastal town. Um, Southeast Northumberland generally gets sort of overlooked. So recently, the train line between Newcastle and Ashington reopened, and it's shocking that it took so long. But good on those who got that sorted. So towns like Ashington, which you know it is quite depressed, and it's a town that sort of lost its purpose since the closure of the mine. I think that things like the railway coming back there will really reinvigorate that. And you can go to places like Woodhorn and discover this fantastic collection of paintings by the Pitman painters, and sort of see that kind of cultural side of things there. And then the last thing I'm going to mention, which I'm kind of duty bound to mention, being from South Tyneside, is the route that you can do. So you can do like a section of the Between the Salt and the Ash Camino, just a little kind of 7 or 8 mile walk between Jarrow and Sunderland, between the two monasteries that Bede lived in. So you sort of leave the south shores of the Tyne and eventually kind of, probably depending on how quickly you walk, kind of maybe half a day or a day later, get down to Sunderland. And that, in a sense, is kind of the region in a microcosm because you've got a mixture of sort of urban landscapes, post-industrial riverside. You've got kind of nice hilly bit in the middle, which is a bit more green and leafy. And you've got all this immense history sitting behind it. So yeah, I'd recommend that everybody straps their walking boots on and gets on Bede's way.